Boston College in 2007. While working as a postdoctoral fellow at the Kennedy School of Government, Harvard University, Laura turned her PhD into her first book, Gender, Justice and the Wars in Iraq, a feminist reformulation of just war theory. This has been followed by an abundance of books, authored and co-authored, and collections edited exploring the role of women and gender in the context of international relations and international security. Laura has also had spells editing the International Feminist Journal of Politics and the International Studies Review. Laura has had a wide number of appointments as both a permanent and visiting scholar at universities across the USA, including the University of Michigan, Virginia Tech, Duke University in North Carolina, and most recently the University of Florida, where she was made full professor in 2019. Laura is best known for her work on issues of gender and security, with a focus on politically violent women, feminist war theorizing, sexuality in global politics, and political methodology. Her work touches on problematic subjects such as women as perpetrators of sexual violence in wartime and the gendered targeting of women as civilians in wartime. Laura joined Royal Holloway in January 2020 with the title of British Academy Global Professor of Politics and International Relations. The period just before the start of the global pandemic now feels to me like another time entirely, but it was just over a year ago. This appointment recognises Laura as a world-class and internationally recognised scholar. We are lucky to have her here at Royal Holloway and proud she is giving her inaugural lecture here tonight. In fact, this is her first inaugural lecture, both as a speaker and attendee, the professorial inaugural lecture being something of a British academic peculiarity that Laura was not warned about. Despite the trying circumstances and disruption to campus life of the past year, Laura has already made a significant impact on intellectual life at Royal Holloway. She has spearheaded the launch of Royal Holloway's Gender Institute, a hub for the study, teaching, learning and activism about gender and sexuality at Royal Holloway. And she's made a real difference already to the work of the Politics, IR and Philosophy Department and the wider School of Law and Social Sciences. Her work, both her research and broader academic contribution, has impact. In her talk for us this evening, Laura will explore the co-constitution of the state and sex in global politics. She will argue that the generation of state borders and the organisation of people who inhabit them, indeed the state itself, cannot be fully understood without reference to sex acts and sexual relationships. Building on feminist and queer theorizing and using examples from dynastic marriage treaties to contemporary partner migration and LGBTQ refugee law, the talk shows how international relations are sexual and sexual relations are international relations. We are also delighted to be joined by Professor Karen Gentry. Professor Gentry is head of the School of International Relations at the University of St Andrews, where she also gained her PhD. Her main research interests cover two areas, gender and terrorism and also feminist political theology. Her work interrogates how gender and other identifiers such as race, class and religion are used to marginalise and disenfranchise, looking at, amongst other case studies, women's involvement in the Palestinian resistance movement and Chechen nationalism. Her 2020 book, Disordered Violence, How Gender, Race and Heteronormativity Structure Terrorism, is a groundbreaking contribution to the field. She has worked extensively with Professor Sjoberg, including co-writing Mothers, Monsters, Whores and its revised second edition, Beyond Mothers, Monsters and Whores, as well as a number of other books and articles. Professor Karen Gentry will deliver a vote of thanks at the end of Laura's lecture. I am now delighted to call upon Professor Laura Sjoberg to give her inaugural lecture entitled Sexual Relations as International Relations.
Thank you, Matthew. I appreciate it. I am going to share some slides and then get started. All right, there we go. Okay, hopefully. You'd think after a year of doing this, one would be better at it than I currently am, but now I have shared the slides, so that works. Welcome and thank you. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my current project, which seems to be a project of multiple monograph-length books on sexual relations as international relations. The research for which I have been in the process of doing this year, although the field research has obviously been a little bit delayed. But I want to tell you a little bit about the project and where it is now and where it's going. So if most current research is to be believed, sex acts and global politics happen in parallel but are not always related. The larger project then that I'm interested in aims to demonstrate that this default position is just plain wrong, that sexual relations are international relations and that international relations are fundamentally sexual. The project pairs two things that some people don't think are related, so I'm going to try and convince you that they are. The first is dynastic marriage and reproduction, and the second is contemporary partner migration and LGBTQ asylum laws. So what I want to do in this conversation is talk to you about both of those halves and then theoretically how they fit into a whole. I want to discuss the relationship between sex and the production of state borders generally, and then discuss the production of meanings of the borders in context of state-sex relationships, discuss in detail the role of the body, sex act, and womb in the making of borders in treaty marriages, and then the ways in which sex acts play a role in contemporary migration and citizenship law. I want to conclude with a discussion of the co-constitution of the Sex Act and the borders of the state. So as a theoretical foundation, feminist work has for decades analyzed the relationship between the heteropatriarchal state and reproduction, gender, and sexuality. The gendered nature of the state has been linked to sexuality and reproduction explicitly in a number of contexts. Key among those for our discussion are repronormativity or reproductive futurism and the violent reproduction of gender. Reproductivity or reproductive futurism is related to state legitimation and prioritization of heterosexual reproduction, where in Spike Peterson's words, nationalist policies involve regulating when, under what conditions, how and how many and whose children women will bear. The making states is making sex phrase here is also Spike's originally. While in Lee Edelman's words, the pervasive invocation of the child as the emblem of futurity's unquestioned value and purpose make reproductive success become an unquestioned nationalist good that serves to impose an ideological limit on political discourse as such, preserving in the process an absolute privilege of heteronormativity in the making of the state. So this is a theoretical starting point for this project, is that understanding that the state, sexuality, and reproduction are intimately and importantly always interlinked. But I want to apply that to thinking about borders and particularly thinking about how states set their membership. So the argument about borders in this piece is that borders aren't fixed. They're things founded and reified by myth, perpetually unsettled, and gendered and sexualized constructions. So I think of border-based sovereignty, as in Judith Butler's terms, a regulatory ideal, the materialization of which is circumscribed by a discursive regime naturalizing statehood, which makes it no longer possible to see borders as a stable referent. So no border is stable because borders are conceptually, psychically, and materially unstable, despite constant claims to their stability. They vacillate between the psychic and the material and cannot be stabilized. So the idea of a border is impossible to stabilize and fundamentally contested in this view. This regulatory ideal, though, of the stable border reifies and is reified by the assumption of compulsory heterosexuality. So constant claims to border stability are related to compulsory heterosexuality, which often defines families, birthrights, and citizenships. Therefore, it's also fruitful to see the borders purported to delineate territory as literal regimes of heterosexuality. Belonging within or being denied belonging within these borders is often linked to sexual lineage, as are the layouts of the borders themselves. Bounded territory, in Butler's terms, circumscribes and is circumscribed by the materiality of sex. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about kind of both halves of this project and then tell you how they relate. So let's talk about treaty marriages. So the background of this slide is an actual marriage treaty. It is not one of the ones that is a case in the book. I'm looking for those, but haven't gotten a copy of them yet. This is the marriage treaty that wed King Charles II of England and Catherine of Braganza in 1661, sealing an alliance between Portugal and England and transferring territory from Portugal to England. The cases in the book are wide and varied. There will be 5 of them. One is the one I'm going to talk about today, which is the marriage of Maria Theresa of Spain and Louis XIV of France. Another is the relationship between Catherine Arthur and Henry VIII in England. A third is Shah Jahan and Mumtaz Mahal in Mughal India, Pakistan. A fourth is a series of marriages in the transition between the Ming and Qing dynasty in China. And the 5th case is the marriage between Razaraya Selassie and Sujitu in late 19th century Ethiopia. So if you want to talk about any of those at any point, I'm not that good at Twitter, but you can email and we can have a conversation. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about the treaty marriage between Louis XIV and Maria Theresa's wedding between Spain and France, and see if I can give you some of the theoretical implications off of that. So treaty marriages are performed around borders, literally on both sides. So often a marriage will occur by proxy at the bride's home. Another marriage ceremony will occur by proxy on the bride's side of the border. And then the actual wedding ceremony will occur on the groom's side of the border, but immediately across the border. So they're actually ritualized around borders fairly frequently. And as Dan Nixon explains, marriage and inheritance played unsurprisingly a central role in interdynastic alliance formation in early modern Europe, which is his subject. This is because, as he argues, dynasts cobbled together composite polities through conquest, marriage, and inheritance. But I want to suggest that it's not only marriage, it's the sex act of marital consummation that plays a significant role. Wars and conflicts were often solved or at least put on hold using the tool of marriage alliances, where governments would agree on the marriage of a member of the royal family of one state to a member of the royal family of the other state as a simultaneous demonstration of the seriousness of their intent to pursue peace, and an insurance policy that the leadership of their former opponent would have an interest in keeping their end of the deal. Most treaty marriages were parts of larger deals, including the payment of reparations and the transfer of territory. The territorial boundaries of proto-states and then states were in large part dictated by who married who had children with who, and whose children laid claim to what land. So many of the treaties included a territory of transfer at the event of the consummation, either explicitly timed or transferred at the time in practice. The consummation was often a public event. And when it wasn't public, it was often publicly shared that it was successful. And when it was unsuccessful, often the spoils of the remainder of the treaty were held until the consummation was successful. So the case that I spent some time with, and I'm going to spend some time with you today on, is the Peace of the Pyrenees. Given that we get to talk on Zoom, note the background of, well, the Pyrenees. But so the Peace of the Pyrenees. Spain and France made a war from 1635 to 1659. So it's one of the only wars that were a part of the, quote, 30 Years' War, which was not solved at the Peace of Westphalia, though there was an attempt. So it continued on significantly longer than that. The Peace of the Pyrenees is the treaty that is negotiated in 1659 and into 1660 in order to bring an end to this long war between Spain and France. It set the border between Spain and France at the Pyrenees. It promised Maria Theresa, who was the Spanish infante, the princess who was the heir to the throne, as a bride to Louis XIV, who had just taken the throne in France, and involved a significant payment from Spain to France as the dowry of Maria Theresa, but really as the payment that they lost the war. So particularly the consummation was highly discussed at the time, and it made its way into a number of historical accounts. Unlike many kings' premarital sexual histories, Louis XIV was made public and bragged about. For those of you who aren't nerds of history at this period, Louis XIII was largely understood as either gay or sexually dysfunctional. He barely had a relationship with his wife, and Louis XIV was his only child. So there was some sense that maybe this lack of proclivity towards sex and lack of virility might be hereditable. So Louis XIV's sexual exploits were of significant interest both before and at the time of his marriage. So the marriage alliance between Louis XIV and Maria Theresa that started when their marriage was consummated adjudicated the violence of the Franco-Spanish War as a part of the Peace of the Pyrenees. Now, this was heavily favorable to France, so Spain lost the war, France won the war. In doing so, then, the marriage and its consummation made both France and Spain with the borders that had been agreed on in the Peace of the Pyrenees, both symbolizing and sealing the transfer of territory between the two states. The consummation of the marriage symbolized the success not only of the marriage, but also of the territory transfer and the presumed stabilization of both the French and Spanish states at the end of this war period. The production of a child, then, would mean that the maintenance of the royal line and therefore the maintenance of the state in the form in which it was perceived and understood at the time. So I'm going to try and make a long story short and tell you a little bit about this production. Maria Theresa had one child known to have lived to adulthood. Ask me about other rumors at some other time. His name was Dauphin Louis. Dauphin Louis had three children, Petit Dauphin Louis, Philip, and Charles. Petit Dauphin Louis had one child, the great-grandchild of Louis XIV. Louis XIV outlived both his son and his grandson, and his great-grandson is actually the person who became Louis XV. But Philip's claim to the Spanish throne was the cause of the War of Spanish Succession in 1700. Philip ended up being the King of Spain for almost 40 years. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how this came to be and why it ends up mattering in terms of the making of the borders. Because this treaty marriage didn't just make the borders of Spain and France in 1660, it then played a significant role in 1700 as well. I mentioned to you the payment that went with Maria Theresa to France from Spain as her dowry. So the payment actually never happened. It was promised and never paid. It is largely understood that the amount of money was so high that there was never any chance that it was going to be paid, but it wasn't paid. And the treaty suggests that Maria Theresa gives up her claim to the Spanish throne if and only if that payment is made. So when the payment wasn't made, Louis XIV made the claim that then Maria Theresa's claim to the Spanish throne, by which he meant her son's claim to the Spanish throne, would then be valid in the event of a transition of the Spanish throne. So in that situation, then the production of the state borders that happened because of the Peace of the Pyrenees ended up having long-standing effects on the production and reproduction of the borders of Spain and France, particularly in that, in theory, Louis XIV could have claimed the inheritance of both thrones to his oldest grandson, which then he did not. But then ultimately they probably would have lost the War of Spanish Succession, which is kind of a history nerd digression, but there you go. So for the purpose of these offspring then, the queen as a person becomes invisible, personally and politically important only in her function of bearing offspring. The queen as a mother is literally the mother to the state. It is her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren to whom the state will fall. And her success in producing offspring that in which the future of the state is invested, and her potential failure at producing offspring in which the failure anxieties of the future of the state may be. So this is how childbearing becomes the function of the queen and yet also makes her invisible. And it's one of the reasons why the successful consummation of the marriage is a mark rather than simply the event of the marriage, because the marriage is wrapped up in this understanding that the purpose of the marriage is reproductive. So in this situation, the borders of the state are being set by a particular ritualized understanding of the sex act of the consummation of marriage. All right, so I'm going to bracket that for a second, and then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the other half of this, and then see if I can convince you that I want to put it together. So the other half of this is about migration law, particularly about 3 different places where gender, sexuality, and sex acts play a significant role in migration law in a number of places around the world. So one is in partner marriage migration. So this is where either you're looking to cross a state border to become half of a partnership or married couple, or you're looking to reunite a pre-existing family. The second is asylum claims. Particularly, I'm interested in asylum claims on the basis of LGBTQ identity, where states are allowing people to come because they are at risk because of their LGBTQ identity, and the laws around that. And then the third, and this is something that is relatively new to me to study, is the rise of queer-friendly entry initiatives, where states require a particular queer friendliness in order to admit future migrants to their state. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the ways in which I think that this matters. So based on Nicola Smith and Donna Lee's argument that political and economic processes are posed on and reproduced by gendered, sexualized, racialized, and otherwise unevenly marked bodies in the migration process, Anne-Marie Dowse says that in effect this means that the border is moving inward. It is lived, embodied, and assessed at a place internal to the body rather than external to the body. So I'm interested here in the ways in which sex acts end up dictating who can and cannot be a member of the state, so who is allowed within the state's borders. So there are a couple of kind of different places where it's important to think and look at this. The first is in claims about authenticity. So authenticity ends up being a serious question to many, if not most, states that allow both partner migration and asylum claims, in terms of, do you have a real marriage? Do you have a real partnership? Are you really of the identity that allows you to come into the state as a refugee and make an asylum claim? So this notion of whether or not you're telling the truth. So in marriage migration, Turner and Espinoza talk about the race, class, and gendered criteria of the genuine couple being shaped through an embedded heteronormativity, which relies on appeals to domestic sustainability and ideas of the reproductive household. And this is the case even when the couple isn't heterosexual in nature. Particularly the truth then of your marriage, or the truth of your identity, ends up being defined not by something essential, but instead by practices of identification. So authenticity is often judged by a number of different kind of indicators or standards. And different states have different indicators or standards. Some of them have to do with looking at how many people know the couple, how they know the couple, how the couple can prove that they have been together, what their families know about them, how much money they have, how long they've lived together. There's a laundry list of about 20 different factors that play into different state laws. But one of them in a number of states is either officially, which is the case in I think about a dozen states, or unofficially, whether or not they're having sex and how much sex they're having and who else they're having sex with, if anyone. That's a bad thing, by the way, if you're looking to be a marriage migrant. Open marriages, not so much in most places. So there's this notion of the performance of a particular relationship and a particular sexuality that needs to be authenticated by the state in their reading of what a real relationship would mean. So marriage performance then becomes something of significant effort, where there are elaborate facades to try to gain legal citizenship, where there's ways in which you have to emulate a particular notion of the idealized heterosexual marriage in order to be allowed marriage or partnership migration. Many decisions that you read turn on, well, this spouse cheated, so maybe they're not really together, or this spouse had a previous lover, and in that world in that country they don't do that, or something like that. So there's a wide variety of judgments about what constitutes a good marriage or a good relationship. Control practices tend to focus on cohabitation, but there are also a wide variety of other factors. Often age differences are something which are weaponized in marriage performances, where it's harder to prove that you're in a legitimate relationship if there's a significant age difference. So there's this notion that you have to perform the heterosexual marriage rites such that whatever your sex and gender, you need to kind of appear to be this traditional couple with 2.3 kids and a dog or something like that. I think that's the average in the United States is 2.3 kids. Not really sure what the 0.3 kid looks like, but not that interested in finding out. Sexuality performance is another important part. So, as I mentioned, often there are actually explicit consummation and cohabitation requirements for partner and marriage migration. Also, many of the states which accept LGBTQ refugees require them to prove that they have physically had LGBTQ sex. And yes, whatever proof that would be is both awful and arbitrary. Some states go so far as to do medical examinations to prove penetration. Excuse me. Whereas others talk about practice, they go through telephones, computers, residences to see if your claimed sexuality ends up lining up with the sexuality that you express in your everyday life. So in the UK, there was a LGBTQ asylum case turned down because the person who claimed to be a gay man had pictures of naked women on the walls of his apartment, which all indications suggest he thought was art. But apparently the ideal queer person would not have pictures of naked people of the opposite sex on his walls. So he ended up having a pretty tough time with that. So performance of sexuality, and particularly normative sexual relationships, is pretty important. And this is kind of a rising trend, the performance of tolerance, and I put tolerance in scare quotes because there's all sorts of things wrong with that word. But I found so far 6 states that when they are having migrants come into the state, they do some sort of test or enforcement of tolerance of LGBTQ sexual identities. So in the Netherlands, which is one of the places where for this happens, for all in migrants, so people who are coming in, there's a variant of a test where you see a gay male couple and you see them holding hands or kissing, and you're warned that some things are common in the Netherlands that are taboo or illegal in other places. And it doesn't mean the drugs, it turns out. So then you're shown these images and asked what you might think of them. So there's some sense then, a scholar named Piper suggests that in the Netherlands, homosexuality is part and parcel of the rhetoric of sexual democracy, where you must demonstrate tolerance for homosexual behavior in order to be allowed into the state to begin with. There have been a lot of analyses of these images, particularly several of the states that use them often weaponize them in a religious sense. So sometimes the people holding hands or kissing are in clearly Muslim religious dress when shown to Muslim people. And there's also kind of a notion that often, even though in theory these are supposed to be shared with Western migrants too, they aren't. So apparently it's assumed that people from particular places in the world would be intolerant and therefore need a lesson, and people from particular places in the world would be tolerant and therefore don't need a lesson. So here is a way in which homonationalism is operating in a way that reinforces who belongs to the state through linking this heteronormative understanding of heterosexual and homosexual identity to the membership in the state. So as we then kind of talk about what these two things have to do with each other, that's what I'm going to spend the rest of my time trying to tell you and convince you about as we kind of close. I have actually increasingly become convinced that these are two separate books, but I want the punchline to be together. So I'm going to tell you about sexual relations as international relations and what I think that I can learn from it and what I think we can learn from it, and see how that goes. So the first is, and I mentioned this at the beginning, understanding borders as a sexualized imaginary. So in the treaty marriage cases, borders are understood as changing as a result of and in relationship to the performance of a sex act of consummation of marriage. So in the case of Spain and France, both states' imaginaries of their territories changed to include and exclude both a single person. So Maria Teresa went from being Spanish one morning to being French the next morning. And the territory that changed hands, here several parcels around the Pyrenees, where the changing constitution takes place around a fantasized marriage and consummation. Borders then are come as a sexualized imaginary, where the trade of territory and sex acts are intimately intertwined. In the case of the marriage and citizenship laws, there's also a fantasy and fantastic understanding of the performance of sex and sex acts. So, for example, I've come to know that the United States Immigration and Naturalization Service, when surveying partner migration and marriage migration, actually has a manual about what sex acts they can ask about to, quote, trip up fake couples. And how they can ask about how they should ask about those sex acts, what things about a body they should ask about, and things like that, which itself becomes actually a fantastic and fantasized entry into someone else's lives and someone else's bedrooms. On the other hand, then there's the production of the performance of the appropriate sexual relationship, which ends up being a fairly complicated understanding. Particularly, there have been criticisms of persons who, for example, take pictures of intimate acts because having someone behind that camera is understood as a non-traditional rather than traditional sexual relationship, and then ends up being the subject of critique rather than documentation of the existence of sex acts. So there ends up being a pretty significant way in which the border is itself sexualized and understood, such that real couples are understood to have national loyalty and unreal couples, quote unquote, are not. Now, that isn't just based on an asexual understanding of couplehood. In fact, several recent decisions, I think I found them in 6 countries now, have denied marriage partnership migration to asexual couples who otherwise meet all of the criteria of a stable relationship. So that's one of the things that's kind of interesting, is an understanding that your relationship is to be trusted if it is genuine, and it is genuine if it is sexual. And obviously sexuality is not the only criteria, but it is a necessary if insufficient condition. Kind of putting those two things aside, there then becomes this understanding of migration across borders with a metaphor of penetration of something foreign into the body of the state, such that national trajectories sometimes talk about migration not only as sexual as relates to the sexuality of individual people who are migrating, but also sexual in terms of a sexual relationship between the individual migrant and the state. So also, and since I'm good at PowerPoint, I put this one above the other one. There's this notion of the state in the bedroom and the bedroom in the state. So the state is interested in what's going on in individual metaphorical bedrooms, because apparently it's fine if it's not in the bedroom. But also some notion that the state has a national security interest in the particular goings on of sex acts among particular couples. These sex acts are understood to be a part of couples which are two people and committed. Those are the sex acts the state reads and finds to be stable. And then crossing that over to thinking about the treaty migration, the treaty marriage part of the book, the bedroom of the state and the bedroom in the state also become a pretty significant theoretical deal. So in some sense, then, there's some notion of how we would understand the state as involved in and present in the bedroom, and then the bedroom as involved in and present in the constitution of not only the state borders, but also state membership. So there's also this imagination of the state through the imagination of consummation. This intimate relationship between territory, trade, and sex acts in treaty marriages was heavily ritualized, and it was centered around the consummation. In fact, the consummation was often physically proved either by being witnessed or by the waving or sharing of bloody bed sheets and other gross things like that. There was often training for consummations, especially if it was unsuccessful the first time. The Catherine the Great, who ended up ruling Russia, was actually trained for her consummation with her husband by being asked to have sex with another man. So there's some celebration of a particular sex act as worthy of ritualization to the extent that other sex acts and can break other norms and mores in order to make it happen. So the importance of this consummation moment makes perfect sense within a feminist queer reading of the co-constitution of sexuality in the state. The state's control and regulation of sex and sexuality has been framed in a way that ensuring the reproduction of a nation, nationalist ideas, and imagined sovereignty, not just a way, but the way, and the way ends up being sexual. Likewise, in the citizenship and migration cases, you see this imagination of the state's membership through the imagination of a particular sexual and sexualized relationship among the state's members, where compliant membership is associated with heteronormativity and homonormativity, and that is displayed through particular sexual behavior. So then, also, there's a consummation of the state's changing relationships. So in the treaty marriage cases, the consummation of treaty marriages was not only a change to the imaginary and actual constitution of each state, but also a consummation of a new relationship between the states and between the state's leaders. How the states related symbolically changed with a sex act and a sexual relationship, where the rebirth or regeneration of states related to, and how they related. So like, between war and not war, between X power configuration and Y power configuration, from a particular familial relationship between the royals, which, spoiler alert, often already existed, to another familial relationship, from not allies to allies, and a wide variety of other reconfigurations, which were political, economic, and military. You can see that the consummation of a treaty marriage is also the consummation configuration trigger of the change in the state of the relationship between the states. And that happens when two people are performing a particular sex act. So in the case of Louis XIV and Maria Theresa, their consummation consummated their marriage, whatever that meant, because neither of them were particularly consulted on the arrangement. Although, unlike many other treaty marriages, neither of them were particularly sad about it. But it also consummated a series of agreements between Spain and France about how the two states would relate after the consummation, being different than how they related before the consummation, such that the consummation signified a consummation of new interstate relationships and orders as much as it did a new marriage. Now, a consummation of states changing relationships can also be seen in the understanding of sex acts in contemporary citizenship migration law. One of the ways that it can be seen that way is as we understand that the movement of people from members of one state to another state is often based on their sexual relationships with people who are members of the other state. That is, that sex acts are actually the currency in which relationships change between people, citizens, and their states. But in addition to that, often states will bring their marriage and partner migration and asylum laws into similarity and compliance with other states with which they have good relationships, such that your ability to enter a state based on a sexual relationship may change based on those states' other diplomatic relationships. So this happens in the EU, where EU states bring their migration policies, particularly their marriage partner migration policies, into compliance with a general EU guidance. But it's not just in the EU that it happens. We found, I think, 21 cases where there was explicitly negotiated changes to one state's marriage partner migration laws because another state changed its marriage and partnership laws, and the two states wanted to make sure that people could move in between them easily. Likewise, on the flip side of that coin, often states weaponize and aim and target particular understandings of what it means to be allowed to be in a marriage migration situation or a partnership migration situation, or even what it means to be LGBTQ for the purpose of asylum, in order to exclude particular populations. So one of the easy kind of ones is that many states define a marriage as between two people, therefore de facto stopping non-monogamous families, so families with more than two spouses, from immigrating together. Likewise, there are, as I told you, the Dutch kind of discussion about how you can't come in if you're intolerant of queer people. So these things aren't randomly targeted. That is, they are targeted at some states and at some cultural groups and at some populations in order to keep them out of the state that is crafting that law. So states are relating through their policing of sex acts within marriage and their policing of the sex acts of people understood to be LGBTQ for refugee purposes. So finally, the consummation of a personal relationship and the consummation of a national membership then end up being things that go together in important ways, such that in a wide variety of contexts over a long time in history, states and their leadership care about who's having sex with whom for the purpose of understanding who's a part of what state and what their status in good standing or not good standing is to that state. So as such, the consummation of personal relationships ends up being related to the consummation of national membership, both in terms of not your personal relationship. So one of the examples I use is, as we were talking about Louis XIV and Maria Theresa, at the event of their consummation, not only does Maria Theresa become French, so do a wide variety of other people who live in territories that have been transferred at that act of consummation, despite their not actually knowing when the consummation occurs. So in some sense, then, some people's personal relationships affect other people's personal relationships in a way that affects their personal relationship with a nation or state. Likewise, if you're applying, for example, for marriage partnership migration, one of the cases that I've done a fair amount of work on already is these applications in Korea. And in Korea, the cheating of the Korean spouse, so the Korean spouse that is sponsoring someone to come into Korea, if the Korean spouse cheats, then it significantly impacts the likelihood that the non-Korean spouse is allowed to come and stay in the country. So as a result, the sexual relationship between two people that are not the person seeking to be allowed to come in ends up influencing the livelihood of the person who is interested in joining that state or nation. So it's not just your personal relationships that set the state borders. It's actually the personal relationships of others that have reverberations on people and set the state borders and who's allowed in them and who's allowed out of them. So this is kind of a first take at this project, making the argument that particularly in terms of the setting of state borders and who is allowed in and out of them, we can't understand international relations without understanding that international relations are sexual, and that sexual relationships are then, as a flip side, international in scope, that the international is in the intimate and the intimate is in the international. And that is the case in a wide variety of sexual relationships, not only the ones that are often highlighted by scholarship on, for example, conflict sexual violence, or something like that. That normal everyday sexual relationships end up being in the normal everyday practice of the setting, resetting, and claim stabilization of state borders. So I think that's my time, which is great because I'm done. So I'm going to take down the PowerPoint and turn over the floor.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and give my vote of thanks to Laura, and for I've been delighted to be here tonight to hear yet another creative and fantastic project coming from Laura. And I have to say that I found this really difficult to write, not because I didn't have anything to say, but because doing justice to Professor Laura Sjoberg's contribution to feminist and queer international relations and to the entirety of IR might just be impossible. Therefore, my Herculean task could have focused on Laura's amazing career achievements and boundary-breaking research. It could and should note that she has carried on the work of her mentor, Ann Tickner, in engaging mainstream IR as a feminist, and how very well she has done this. I could name her various editorial positions, her H-index, her citation scores, all of these quantitative indicators we use to demonstrate importance, which these certainly do reflect in Laura's case. Yet Laura is all of these things, but also so much more than these things. So instead, let me start my vote of thanks with a quote from Sarah Ahmed. Queer and feminist worlds are built through the effort to support those who are not supported because of who they are, what they want, what they do. To me, this is a better beginning point for capturing who Laura is and what she has done for feminist and queer IR. Laura has intentionally, purposefully built the world that she wants to see. She has done this for so many people in our field through immeasurable encouragement, support, mentoring, co-authoring, and teaching. I know this because I hear about it and witness it. Moreover, I know this because I've benefited from it. So Laura and I met at ISA when we were both straight out of our PhDs. I heard her give 2 papers, one on feminist methodologies, and then a year later on the women who participated in torture at Abu Ghraib. After both papers, I talked with her, but it was her paper on Abu Ghraib that meant the most, because finally, I found another feminist observing the same phenomenon I was in my research on women who participated in terrorist violence. We went to lunch and plotted a panel at the following year's ISA, and the rest, you can say, was history. That panel led to our co-authored book, Mothers, Monsters, Whores. I've always maintained that our co-authoring relationship was more than just co-authorship. I'd come out of my PhD program with little mentoring, and I landed in a very teaching-heavy position. Through my writing with Laura, I found a mentor, a friend, an encourager, and a teacher. She was someone who demystified academia. She pushed me to go further and think bigger. And moreover, we enjoyed and still enjoy working together. She became a friend, a collaborator, a fellow plotter, someone to gossip with and to travel with. I don't know that I've ever had more fun working, much less writing, with someone else. You hear all the time what a trial it is to work with a co-author. Not so with Laura and I. I have one vivid memory of the January we finalized Mothers, Monsters, Whores. I was stuck in my house due to an ice storm. Laura was doing a long distance drive. We pinged chapters back and forth for days. She used her phone for a signal, and no, she wasn't driving, I think. She possibly could have been driving, knowing how Laura drives, with confidence and assertiveness. So, as is our style, when one of us got as far as we could with a section, the other picked it up. A former professor of mine said he read Mother's Monstrous Whores looking to see what sections I wrote and what sections Laura wrote. Luckily, we defeated him. He couldn't figure it out. And that's because we work so closely together and so well together. I've never had another relationship like it. I also watched Laura do the same with other people she meets. She is tireless in championing work she finds interesting. She co-edits volumes, special issues, and other books to extend various helping hands to scholars across feminist and queer IR. She does all of this with a distinct sense of vision, voice, and unwavering determination. She embodies the feminist ethos of collaboration, amplification, and intentionality. Therefore, it delights me to call Laura Professor Sjoberg. And Professor Sjoberg, we find someone who has rebuilt the world for more feminist and queer voices to join it. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you, Professor Karen Gentry. Thank you very much. Students, colleagues and friends, thank you all for coming to this special online inaugural lecture. I know you will want to join me in offering congratulations once again to Professor Laura Sjoberg.